Hello everybody, I am Halil İbrahim Kalkan, the lead developer behind the ABP framework. ABP is an open source web application framework to create modern web applications based on the ASP.NET Core. It provides infrastructure to implement enterprise-level software requirements, handles and automates common development tasks for you to make you focus on your own business code without repeating yourself. In this video course, we will create a new web application based on the ABP framework. The example application called Bookstore is a typical back-office application to manage books and their authors. The course will proceed step by step and will cover all the aspects of a typical web application, including localization, authorization, database integration, HTTP APIs, user interfaces, and so on. It will also cover some basic principles of the domain-driven design. Let's begin by creating the application. Clicking to the Get Started page. We have two options to create a new application using the ABP framework. The first option is using the ABP CLI, a command line interface tool, or we can directly download from the website. I will use the ABP CLI. If you haven't installed it before, use .NET Tool install command. I have already installed it, so I'm just typing abp new acme.bookstore. This is the solution name of my application. It downloads the template and creates the application for me. Now I can open the solution in Visual Studio. The solution created has been layered based on the domain-driven design principles. You can find all the details of the solution in the ABP framework documentation. For now, you may not understand the full solution structure, but don't worry, you will recognize the projects throughout the development of the application. In brief, domain layer is separated into two projects. Domain project contains the domain layer of the solution, entities, domain services, repository interfaces, and so on. Domain.shared project is a part of the domain layer, but it is shared among all the layers. It typically contains constant and enum values. Application layer is also separated into two projects. Application.contracts project contains the interface of the application services as well as data transfer objects defined for these application service interfaces. Application project has the implementation of the services defined in the contracts project. Entity Framework Core project contains our DB context and database mappings for the entities. There is a separate Entity Framework Core.db migrations project that is used to unify the database migration. This solution uses code-first approach to manage the database schema. There is also a handy application named DB Migrator, which is a console application that simplifies migrations and seeds the database. It's useful for development and production environments. HTTP API project contains all API controllers of the solution. Since the ABP framework has conventional API controller system, you mostly don't need to create API controllers manually. But if you need, here the project you typically want to create API controllers. HTTP API.client project contains client proxies for .NET applications those want to use your HTTP APIs. You can share this project to a client application so it can easily consume your APIs. Again, ABP framework automates to create dynamic C# proxies. So you typically don't write any code here. It automatically works. Finally, the web project contains the user interface of your application. Test folder contains unit and integration tests separated for each layer. This solution uses a database. So we have a connection string in the app-settings.json file of the web project. The pre-configured configuration for the database is local DB of SQL Server. So I will not change it. It will use bookstore database. In addition to the web project, the DB migrator has also a app-settings.json file which has the same connection string here. So if you want to change the connection string, remember to change both locations. DB migrator project can be used to easily create the database and seed the initial data. So I'm just right-click here and run the application. Okay, it created the database, now executing the seed data and completed. Now our database is ready. So if we want, we can just run the application to see the user interface before beginning the development. Right click to the web application, web project, and set as startup project. Now we can run it via Ctrl F5 or directly F5. It's building and okay. ABP is a modular application framework. There are some pre-built modules. This startup template comes with account, identity, tenant management, and some other useful modules pre-installed for you. So, when we click to the login page, we see the login form of the account module pre-installed. There is a standard admin user and admin password. When we log into the application, we can see some menu items on the main menu. Identity management contains the identity management related pages. For example, role management page is used to manage roles and their permissions in the application. When we define new permissions, they will appear here and we can be able to grant permissions to users and roles. Identity management user page shows the current users of the application. We can create, delete or edit current users. Tenant management is for multi-tenancy. You can create new tenants. Each tenant will have their own data isolated from other tenants, like they have separated users, roles, and other data. This template and also the framework supports localization, so we can switch languages, you can see. And there is a profile management page, like changing password or setting the profile informations. Okay, I'm logging out from the application. Let's start the development. I'm turning back to the Visual Studio. I will begin by creating a book entity in the domain project. First, I want to create a folder, name it books, and a class inside it, name it book. abp-framework provides some base classes to create entities. So I want to inherit the book entity from the audited aggregate root of GUID. GUID means that the book entity will have a GUID primary key. Aggregate root is a typical aggregate root base class for the entities. Aggregate and aggregate roots are concepts of domain-driven design. For now, you can think that our entities, or root entities, typically derived from the aggregate root class. And the book is one of our root entities of the application. Audited aggregate root inherits from the aggregate root and adds some auditing features, like when I check the definition, you can see last modification time, last modifier ID, and it's also inherited from creation audited aggregate root, which has creation time, creator ID, and so on. So we have typical auditing properties inherited from the base class. These properties are automatically managed by the ABP framework. That means you don't have to set last modifier ID or last modification date whenever you change the entity. It's handled by the framework. Now I want to add some properties to the book entity. I will define the book type as an enum type. Okay, let's create the book type as an enum. I will copy enum members from documentation. Now I have a book type enum and a book aggregate root. Enums are typically defined in the domain shared project because we want to reuse this enum from the user interface and the application layers. So I am just moving this to the domain shared project. Okay, the namespace remains same. Now I have a book and book type. The next step is to map this book entity to the entity framework mapping. We have a book store DB context in the entity framework core project. Yeah, in the entity framework core project, you see the bookstore DB context, which is the DB context of our own application. Now I will add a DB set property for the new book entity. Now I should define the low-level mappings for the database. We have bookstore DB context model creating extensions for that purpose. Here we can define mappings using the full-end mapping feature of the entity framework. Just copy paste here. Okay, I will explain, don't worry. We are mapping the books entity to the table of with a prefix. The typical or default prefix or open application tables are app. So the books table prefix will be app. So the full name will be app books. Also, you can control your schema in a single place in this constant class. The next statement is configure by convention extension method of the ABP framework. Remember that book entity is derived from audited aggregate root, which has some properties. This configure by convention method automatically understands these base properties and configures them by conventions. So you don't worry to configure the base properties. You just need to configure your own properties if you need. For example, for the name property, we want to make it recurrent and with as much length of 128. After that, we can just create a new database migration using the entity framework command line tools. Just open the package manager console, select the entity framework core.db migrations as the default project and the web project as the startup project. Now run the add migration. We can name anything, no problem. This will typically create a migration file. Okay, we could just write update database as you are used to do in a typical entity framework core application. But before that, I want to create some seed data for the books. ABP framework has a data seed system, so we can just create a new class. Name it bookstore data seeder contributor. Derived from data seeder contributor and register to the dependency injection. When we implement iTransient dependency for a class, it is automatically registered to dependency injection system as a transient object. The dataseed contributor is an interface of the dataseed system. When we implement this interface, ABP framework automatically discovers this class and executes it when we seed the database. I'm just copying the seed code from the documentation. So in this seed method, you can just use the repositories to insert some data. The constructor gets the iRepository of book and GUID for the book repository. This is default interface of the book entity and automatically created by the ABP framework. So you can just inject iRepository for the book entity and use its standard methods here. In the seed method, we check if there is no book in the database. We are inserting 2 new books. Book repository.insert method gets an entity and some additional options like autosave. We set just a few just the properties of the entity and just created 2 entities in the database. Now we can run the DB migrator project. The DB migrator project will migrate the database schema, then execute the seed data. So now we have books table in the database and also two sample books in the database table. We can continue from the application layer. For the books, we will create an application service to manage books, create, update, delete, and get list of books. For this reason, we will use the base CRUD app service class of the ABP framework, which is a base class that contains all these CRUD operations out of the box. It requires to define our data transfer objects and inherits from the CRUD app service base. First, I want to create data transfer objects, creating the books folder in the application contracts, because application contracts is the place we create our data transfer objects. Creating a new class, name it book DTO. I want to derive the book DTO from audited entity DTO of GUID. Auditing into the DTO is similar to the audited base classes for the entities. It provides modification and creation audited properties as the base properties. So we don't have to define all these properties again. We can just add the actual properties of the data transfer objects. For this application, I want to show all the book properties on the user interface. So I just copied the properties of the entity to the book DTO. When I query the books from database, I need to create book DTOs for these entities. For this reason, in this tutorial, we will use AutoMapper library, which simply maps entities to data transfer objects. So the solution already pre-configured to use the AutoMapper. In the application layer, I am editing the bookstore application AutoMapper profile. AutoMapper requires to define mappings before using the mapping code. So I inherited from the profile class of the AutoMapper and defining the mappings. Create map book DTO. Okay, it is simple. I just defined the mapping from book to book DTO. Now I can continue to create with the second data transfer object, which is used to create or update books. I'm not inheriting from any base class in this time. I am using the same data transfer object to create and update books. It can be separated, but I prefer to use the same object. In the data transfer objects, we can use data annotation attributes to perform the validation of data transfer objects. ABP framework and also ASP.NET Core automatically uses these properties to validate the input of the user. Just like done for the book DTO before, we should define the mapping from the create update book DTO to the book entity. So I'm opening the mapping class again and writing create map for create update book DTO to book entity. Now I can define the interface for the application service. I'm creating a new interface, name it book iBook app service. Just stated before, we will inherit from the CRUD app service base to not manually write CRUD operations. I'm just copying from the documentation. CRUD app service CRUD app service interface defines delete, update, create, and get operations for the given generic parameters. Book DTO is the generic parameter to be used to get list of entities. GUID is the primary key of the entity. Paged and sorted result request DTO is used to page and sort the entities to get paging and sorting parameters from the user interface. You can create your own DTO for this reason, but the pre-built class makes it easy and standard way. The last parameter is create update book DTO. Specify which DTO is being used to create or update books. Now we can implement this interface in the application project. I am creating a new class. Name it book app service. Just like the interface, I'm just inheriting from the CRUD app service. Okay, it's just like the interface. This service requires some generic parameters to work with our entity. The first parameter is the entity itself, the book entity. The second parameter is the data transfer object to show books on the user interface. GUID is the primary key of the entity. The same sorting and paging parameter, DTO, and finally the create update book DTO. And we also implemented the iBook application service that's defined before. We haven't implemented any method manually because the CRUD app service base already provides all the methods implemented for us. It just requires a repository of book that's used to perform CRUD operations. That's all. We have finished the application layer. Now I want just run the application and show a magic of the ABP framework to you. We have just written the application layer and we haven't created any application, any API controller for now. Now I want to open the Swagger UI that's pre-configured in the startup template. Swagger is a tool that is used to show the HTTP API of the application, and also it provides tooling to test the APIs. When we open the Swagger, we can see a lot of services and APIs in the applications. We haven't written any of these services, but they are coming from the pre-built modules. We can also see a book service and it is APIs in the Swagger UI. Notice that we haven't created any API yet, but ABP framework automatically creates APIs, the REST APIs for our application services by conventions. This, let's see the APIs. The first API endpoint creates a new book with the post HTTP method. The second one gets a list of books. The third one replaces or updates a book. The fourth one deletes a book, and the last one gets a book with its ID. Let's try the get list of books endpoint. Executing with default parameters. The server returns the result as a JSON result. We see that the books in the database. We haven't created any endpoint. The ABP framework automatically creates for us. So in this way, we have also finished the HTTP API layer. We can just go to the user interface.